Welcome back. I'm Ian.
I'm Steve.
We are continuing to talk about zooming in, zooming out, and the amount of time and action that is encompassed in a single success or failure.
Now, what we're talking about here can really be applied to pretty much any situation in the Downbelow RPG, but we're starting with combat for a couple of simple reasons. The main reason is actually conditioning. If you look at the development of role-playing games, and you stay away from a lot of independent and storyline-centered games, you're going to see stuff like Dungeons & Dragons where there's a conditioning going on. Players are generally conditioned that combat, because of the way the rules are written, combat takes place in multiple discrete roles and moments, whereas non-combat situations take place with one role representing the entire exchange. We are conditioned to accept that, and that leads to times when combat sessions lead to time passing at a crawl, non-combat sessions lead to time zooming on forward, and then you get the weird moments when the two collide, and a player wants to, in a 6-second combat action, convince the bad guy's right-hand person to abandon everything they've worked for with a single diplomacy roll, because that's how diplomacy works, but there's no real good mechanical guidelines for condensing that down into a single 6-second combat action, and yet the rules don't explicitly state you can't try that. So we're already conditioned that non-combat is zoomed out, combat is zoomed in. So we're starting first to say that combat can also be zoomed out, and non-combat can be zoomed in just as easily.
So let's start with the zooming out. In the case of combat, when you zoom out, you are taking a look at this fight situation and saying, this isn't all that interesting dramatically to look at. You guys have been ambushed by goons, but we don't want to spend all night going back and forth with goons.
We touched on this a little bit last time with the brief zoom out when, with 2 successes, you took out an entire walkway full of Mafia gunmen. Maybe not permanently, but enough to get them out of the fight. If you look at such movies as Kill Bill, the famous Bride versus the Crazy 88 scene, that was pretty zoomed out. There was wonderful, wonderful fight choreography going on, but what we were more concerned about was the overall flow of the fight, not the individual attack rolls going on against individual mooks. We cared about when the wacky, colorful henchman walked into the scene, but not when the cannon fodder was there to give the bride a chance to show off.
In terms of our system, she might have had to use 2 or 3 successes on the cannon fodder for the multiple different waves of cannon fodder that came around and between the more colorful henchmen. And for the colorful henchmen, each one of those might have been 1 to 3 successes required to defeat them, especially the ones that actually wounded her a little bit.
So at that medium level of zoom, the cannon fodder actually represented 2 things. For the GM, that represented a narrative threat that was there to drain player successes, but not a lot of them. However, for the player, that was actually there as an opportunity for them to recharge their traits to deal with the actual threats. Hi, with this one large wave of goons, I can take a hit, 1 hit, to replenish some of my successes, maybe even 2 hits to replenish some successes, and then take them out, so that I have traits left to deal with the actual threats. And you'll notice that she didn't kill all of them all at the same time. Members of each wave were still going at it while she was dealing with the rest. So,
now, taking that example and segging it into non-combat things.
Yeah.
This kind of zoomed out behavior, if you are familiar with role-playing games, is probably pretty familiar to you when you're dealing with things like social and information and knowledge-based actions, because those we are trained to resolve entire quests for knowledge, entire gathering information in the streets of the city in a single action, because those are often treated as the less interesting thing.
Right.
The traditional role-playing game, Dungeons & Dragons, the most popular one out there, treats as its most interesting thing fighting monsters and taking their stuff, and everything else is less interesting. That's not necessarily the case in this game.
For instance, here's an example of an uninteresting combat sequence. Are you familiar with an old movie called Terminator? Arnold Schwarzenegger's character, an invincible robot from the future, begins his introduction to us by walking naked into a bar and telling the biker, "I need your clothes, your boots, and your motorcycle." Shortly thereafter, we cut to the outside where Schwarzenegger has his clothes, his boots, and a motorcycle. The implication is there was a fight, but the foregone conclusion was our invincible robot won. This is a zoomed-out fight. That fight in that movie, and later versions of Terminator and the like, would actually show us that fight, and all it really does is the same thing. It establishes that these bikers can't beat the robot. The original Terminator does it elegantly by saying, "Guys, you know he can't beat the robot. Let's just cut to him starting the motorcycle." Whereas later versions of that and knockoff versions would show the fight in the bar to establish that the robot was in fact indestructible and waste valuable footage doing it because we already know that Schwarzenegger's character is an invincible robot from the future.
So, when you have these uninteresting fight scenes, that's when you want to zoom out and say, well, you're going to have to deal with this, and this threat, and each of those will take a success to defeat. But other than that, it's not worth getting into the details.
Right.
And then the players who have characters involved can choose how they're going to deal with the threats and what, if any, failures they're going to take and complications from that. And then you can move on to the next more interesting thing.
And a lot of that moving on, which we're going to be doing shortly, really does hinge around knowing your players, knowing your players' expectations, and managing that. And that's actually why, as we're about to mention, we're going to talk about zooming in non-combat situations next time.
Thanks for falling through the cracks with us. Stay tuned, and please follow us, subscribe, and tell us what you like in the comments below.